Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Social Venture Partners Dallas. Welcome to our 2021 Response, our first one in the new year. We first started this response series back in March when the shelter-in-place orders first came down, and we have been having monthly conversations with community leaders ever since. They have been important conversations and consistent with the mission of Social Venture Partners. That Social Venture Partners are men and women come to us and they join Social Venture Partners to give their time and their talent and their financial resources to grow the capacity of social enterprises, organizations working to bring systemic change and to help solve some of our society's most difficult problems. In addition to the pro bono consulting services that we offer to social enterprises, we also convene community-wide conversations and impact conversations, and we provide educational opportunities to our audiences. We are grateful to have you here with us today and at the start of a new year. You know, not only do we believe and see only potential for each of our members of society, but we also see the obligation for institutions to take up their role for good in the world. And I am joined by two panelists who also believe that institutions have a role to play in moving society forward. And I want to welcome them to our conversation today. I am delighted to have Sarah Jackson with us. Sarah is the Vice President of Strategy and Public Affairs with the Dallas Citizens Council. I have been a fan of Sarah's for many years, and I am grateful for the opportunity to get to do a project with Sarah today, and I hope that we can have many more. Additionally, we have with us Grant Luis, who is the president and publisher of the Dallas Morning News. I know, Grant, that this is an extraordinary time in the news cycle, and for you to give us an hour of your time today, particularly at this point in time in history, is not only a sacrifice, but it is an honor for us to have you here. And again, thank you for all that you do for Social Venture Partners and the larger community. You've been with us a number of times at various events, and we are grateful for that. Sarah, I wanted to start a little bit and get your perspective, maybe shape the conversation for us today. You know, we practice call last week, and none of us could have seen the events that were coming down the pike. And so we want to get to our topic, which is the year in review from Grant's perspective and the Dallas Morning News's perspective, but we have to shape the conversation in light of what we're currently in. So Sarah, I'm going to turn it to you for a minute, and then we'll turn it over to Grant.
Yeah, last week I found to be extremely enlightening, disheartening, and sobering. I think we all can agree civil discourse, that civility and discourse separated, are part of the building blocks of our democracy. But I think what we saw last week is the fragility of our democracy and the work that we've got to do together for the sake of our democratic system. That means believing in our democratic institutions, which includes our election systems. I think, I'll now kick it over to Grant, but I think, really what you have seen in the video and all the images captured from last week is that the fourth estate is clearly functioning well. And I give credit to the Dallas Morning News because they're clearly functioning well from downtown Dallas. The only, criticism, if anything, from last week, I would say, from looking at the Dallas Morning News coverage, is that the one perspective that you didn't see covered in the paper yet is the perspective of the rioters and sizable Trump supporters or Americans who believe the election wasn't fair and was stolen. But I think given what happened last week, I think we can all agree that part of why you don't see that perspective is because the press does take seriously its role as the fourth estate of our government and that responsibility. I will say I am curious as a Republican to see, the future of the party. I mean, it's clearly no longer Lincoln's party, Nixon's party, or Bush 41's party. But it could be an amalgamation of several strong Republican presidents in our history. And that's, I think, the next frontier is how does the Republican Party become more inclusive and become more true to its party values? And so these are some of the reflection points I'm thinking of as it related to last week. But I would say it's quite a reflective moment and a turning point in our nation last week.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for joining us. Sarah, I appreciate you, and I am looking towards to you to have some responses to the points that Grant makes throughout our conversation. So thank you for being with us. Grant, of the many disheartening moments, last week there was the moment when, the coverage of the institution of a free press was being physically attacked, equipment being destroyed, reporters being threatened. It is a tough time in your industry. Share with us a little bit about your perspective on things and what you see going forward.
First of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be with you all. I think it is a fascinating time in our country, and as you all can imagine, it's a fascinating time to be in the media. Not only what happened, the past week, but I'd say this kind of era that we're living in, and especially with one of the things my team and I take so seriously is just this concept of trust. I think, as we all know, who are here today, without trust, you have no relationships in your life. You don't have a healthy marriage without trust. You don't have a healthy friendships without trust. And, here we are in the media. And part of what we're really trying to do here at the Dallas Morning News is figure out how to keep that trust. You had mentioned, Tony, just the concept of safety. Safety is extremely important to us right now. We're keeping a very close eye on the way that we're securing our facilities, the way that we're protecting our journalists. It's odd to me. I'll have a very good relationship with another publisher in the country whom I won't name, but I'll tell you he's a rather famous publisher, and his father was a famous publisher of the same exact company. And I said, well, what happens around your dinner table when you talk about what's different today than what was different in your father's era of running this newspaper? And he said, very simply, the money they have to spend on security for their journalists is significantly higher than it ever was under his father's regime. And it just makes me sad, but it also is a reminder that, protecting democracy and trying to protect and be that fourth estate that Sarah referred to is just critically important. Let me do this. I think what may be helpful, Tony, if it's fine with you, is I wanted to just get into a little bit of maybe even break it down into some categories of really what we saw as top stories last year. And I kind of starting with, and I don't want to go skip coronavirus straight to the elections. So is that okay with you?
Sure, please proceed.
Great. First, let me kind of say part of what I was doing in preparation for today is when we talk about what were the biggest stories in 2020, I thought it'd be helpful for you all to understand is how I selected those. And I selected them based on the number of people who read these stories in our newspaper or really online, which is where we know exactly where our audience, what they're consuming. And so it was an amazing year for us in 2020. The Dallas Morning News, we averaged 12.5 million people a month reading our content, which in a company that is 135 years old, as the Dallas Morning News is, these are some of the biggest audiences we've ever seen in our history. And what we talk about when we decide what we're going to publish is we try to figure out not only what is important for our society and why, but most importantly, what's important to North Texas and why. I just want to be clear, a lot of things you're going to see me talk about today are trying to localize even some of these national issues, because the role of I can't out New York Times, the New York Times, out Wall Street Journal, the Wall Street Journal, nor the same thing with the Washington Post. I simply don't have those kind of resources, but also it's not the charge that we are providing to the Dallas Morning News. What we're trying to do is to make sense of our country, make sense of the world, and make sense of our community for North Texans. So I give that a little bit as a backdrop. But I would say the biggest story of the year was clearly coronavirus. When we think about what we're all working through right now, and we all know this is a once in a century type pandemic, but over 22.5 million cases of COVID have been reported in the United States. We just crossed over 375,000 deaths. I mean, this is as we all know, we're sitting here on Zoom screens looking at each other and listening. And I think we would all much rather be in a room full of us kind of getting that energy and having the face-to-face debate. But, when we've talked about what has happened in Texas, which is really kind of a keen interest to us at the morning news, is, we've just gone over 1.9 million cases in Texas. That ranks us, just to give you a sense on ranking, that puts us about 21st in the United States when you kind of put us into the per 100,000 residents. And we do that to try to make sure it's apples to apples. So at 1.9 million cases and over 30,600 deaths, we're really around 20th or 21st in the country in terms of, I'd say, how we have handled the pandemic. It almost makes me feel guilty to talk about a ranking, because you shouldn't be talking about rankings when we're talking about deaths. But I do think that the health of what we're trying to accomplish as a state, because this has also become a very localized topic. I asked a group of people in a similar kind of talk like this about 3 months ago, how many of you, these were all people under the age of 40. And I said, how many of you knew who Clay Jenkins was a year ago? And out of about 100 people, 10 of them raised their hands. Then I said, how many of you know who Clay Jenkins is today? And they all basically raised both hands. But the point that made to me within coronavirus and within local news and information was very eye-opening, because it made us realize how much local government can impact one's life more, arguably, than the federal government. And so, very interesting story. We're very focused, especially looking forward on coronavirus, to think about how is this pandemic going to impact our society moving forward. I mean, we're learning, especially in North Texas, it's making that income inequality gap wider, which is very concerning to us at the morning news. We've realized the value of access to high-speed internet. Many people can't do what we're doing and actually can't listen to us live today because they do not have broadband access or can't afford broadband access. And even things like our uninsured rate in the state of Texas has become kind of top of mind as it relates to the pandemic. Let me touch on a couple other things, Tony, of what I would call some of the community impact stories of 2020, and then I'll pause so that we can dialogue a little bit. The second one is where Sarah started, which was 2020 was an election year that gave the biggest voter turnout in the history of our country. Obviously, with what happened last week and what continues to happen around the validity of the election process, kind of the state of our federal government as a result of kind of what's being questioned, how it's being questioned, and we can talk about that. I know we'll probably go there here a little bit in Q&A, but I wanted to kind of also talk about what happened in Texas in 2020 elections, because there's been this big question of, are we a battleground state? And what I can tell you is we were in terms of funding. If you look at the 10 most hotly contested House races that we had from the state of Texas, there was 4 times as much spending as there was in just 2016's election. So, I mean, when you talk about spending in these races growing 4 times, it's clear that at least the funding has given some signal that some people think that Texas is a battleground. However, none of those seats, shifted from red to blue. They were Republican incumbents, and they continue to be Republicans in those seats today. So it really is interesting, and especially we saw that with the senator race where John Cornyn, although there was a thought that MJ Hagar was going to challenge him more closely, he won by a fairly comfortable margin. However, the spending was significant again there. So that is one of those things that as we think of, and as all of us got to witness Georgia last week, what are the differences maybe politically between a state like Texas and a state like Georgia? Well, I can tell you from our vantage point, the spending showed that there's a feeling that we were, it may be a more a pivotal point of shifting from red to blue than we were in reality. But one thing I'll also touch on as it related to the election, because it was an important change for us here at the Morning News. This was the first time we had not endorsed for President of the United States. We chose a different strategy in 2020 that, rather than being what I kind of really referred to with my team as, over 700 newspapers endorsed for president. And so we were really questioning the value. What does it mean to be the 699th newspaper to endorse for president, when really our value, we feel, is about providing more of the community service of talking about county judges, talking about the local races where you can't find that information in even 5 newspapers as to who is someone you should vote for these important local down ballot races. And so we believe that pouring our resources into those things that are truly covering North Texas were more important than just endorsing for president. But we also believed strongly that then what were we going to do and how would we fill that void? And we published a 5-part series that we called What's at Stake. And what we did there is we covered things like foreign policy, the economy, presidential leadership, and culture, so that we could provide a variety of viewpoints as to kind of what are the main issues that people were going to face at the voter box, and then encourage them, in that case, to make their own decision, because an official endorsement was not going to be really original content, because, as I mentioned, over 700 newspapers were going to endorse, so that information could really be found, just about anywhere. So, we took a different approach last year. And look, I've been open to the criticism. I've heard it. I've heard people think that in some ways that was cowardly. I beg to differ. I really think what we were trying to do was to reduce the theater. And the hard part is we're watching a lot of media coverage of what's happening feels very theatrical to us. And this was a very much an effort to make sure that we were playing more of a part of civility rather than adding to the theater type feel of what was happening in the presidential election. So
I'm gonna interrupt.
I'll pause there.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Sarah, I'd like to hear your response to those two issues. Clay has done a great job in Dallas County, but it seems like he's had to fight state and federal elected officials. And it seems like there is a vast difference in the approach to how we should be managing the pandemic. What kind of your response to that a little bit, and why there has to be that fight about paradigms around the pandemic? And then also, I'd love to hear your opinion on the Dallas Morning News' decision not to endorse a presidential candidate. So take it away.
So how much time do we have, Tony? Because it sounds like in both of those issues, we could be here at least for 45 minutes. And, as we all get back to safely getting together and actually having more civility in our culture, would love to sit down with anybody to talk about this. But to your question specifically, let's start with the pandemic, and let's even, we can go on to the elections. But in both of those circumstances, I think the thing that we have to point out, and we would be remiss in not mentioning, is that both the pandemic and the elections have a undertone of racial injustice. I think, with both the pandemic, and specifically with the pandemic, people of color have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And so with that, I think the approach to the point, Tony, takes a different tone. And I think now, as we're starting to roll out vaccines, we see sort of the same tension related to sort of the systematic injustice coming back. And I think that's, sort of the real challenge here from the local and state approach, Tony, to your point. But I think in the state of Texas, what has been really the driver in managing our pandemic in Texas, as we all know, is sort of that tension between the state and the locals, with a Republican governor at the helm of the state, and then many urban cities in our state being governed by Democratic officials. the approach has been clear. I will say, one of the things I have been encouraged by is the fact that much of the news coverage didn't focus so much on the difference in the politics. I think at the end of the day, it's clear to many people that this pandemic has two fronts. It's an economic front, and it's more importantly, it's a healthcare front. Just taking it local, as Grant said, and looking at Mayor Eric Johnson's latest numbers last night in that email that many of us get, 76% of hospital beds in Dallas are occupied right now, and 82% of the ICU beds are occupied. That leaves very little room for much other, traffic accidents, heart attacks, other things that happen. And so we can see we're moving locally very much closer to overwhelming our healthcare system. And that should be of the utmost concern to everybody on this call. So when you talk about the local entities, municipalities, their ability to manage these crises, that tension will continue. And as we'll talk later about the Texas legislative session that kicks off today, cities and counties are again trying to hold on to their autonomy and their ability to service their citizens and their residents. That issue is a big deal. I know a lot of people, haven't really been following it. It's sort of complicated, right? The whole tension between the state and the local, and you can no longer say, well, it's a Republican or Democratic issue. It's really going across multiple lines. And so I think with that, as we continue to look at this pandemic and work through it, some of the macro trends, I know Politico magazine, to keep it in the media realm, had a great piece last year about the macro trends that we will see emerge from this pandemic related to innovation and the insecurities that have come to light, specifically on the social American front. So I think our society really is probably continuing to adapt and evolve from this. And related to the election endorsement, I mean, Grant, I have the utmost respect. I've grown up reading the Dallas Morning News. I still read it every day, have a subscription. But one of the things I was thinking is you were talking about the endorsement and whether or not it made sense for y'all to be the 699th endorsement was, really understanding, do we have data? Like, what is the impact of a lot of these endorsements? I mean, I know I've had conversations with civic leaders who say, I don't even pay attention to the endorsements. But for some people, I know when they see the endorsements, it's like, oh, there's an election coming up. It's an awareness feature. And so endorsements, whether they be local races or national races, can play multiple roles. But I think the question is whether or not it really helps the citizens, right, the readers, to be able to get that next hurdle. But the last thing I wanted to bring up related to the elections, as I was looking at the data on this, I mean, we can all agree that the 2020 election was phenomenal. I mean, we saw higher voter turnout. We saw new voters, younger voters, more diverse voters. Really, people turned out. And it's amazing to see that we, almost like in the state of Texas, we almost had 70% of our population out for this. I mean, that's amazing. We have never seen those numbers before. But I think the real challenge as we look at historical data related to midterm elections and local elections, generally in midterms, we look at a voter turnout roughly around 50% or so. And then in local elections, we're in the single digits. I mean, many of you might remember back in 2017, Dallas was considered one of the worst voting cities in the entire country. I mean, that's not a flattering designation and distinction. And so I think the real question, and hopefully, what is keeping some people up at night, I know it's keeping me up at night to some extent, is, where do we go from here? So many people who turned out in 2020, are you going to turn out in May? There's a city council election, in some cities there are school board elections. And these are the people, to Grant's earlier point, the local leaders are the ones who really are making the decisions related to what's outside your door and related to how your office functions. And really it impacts your life from the grassroots, like, something you can see, tangibly feel. And so I think the real question is everybody going to turn back out in May and going forward to support these local leaders so we can get up above single digit voter turnout in Dallas? And I would hope that, people are thinking about that and ready to turn out in May.
I appreciate that, Sarah Grant. I'm going to turn it back to you and, talk about this notion of leadership and the Dallas Morning News as a leader in the community and the governor as a leader. And, when folks aren't wearing masks or when they're not endorsing particular candidates, you're saying something about your leadership position. And so, I just want to throw that out there, that leaders have a responsibility to the community, I think, to model and to witness the right direction and the moral high ground. So I'll leave that there. I want to get more back to your highlights a little bit, if you will. And if you want to pick up another topic from a highlight from 2020, let's hear what you have to say.
Sounds good. No, and I did want to touch on, I think Sarah made such a good point on this difference between municipal voter turnout and the way that we turn out here in North Texas for these federal election cycles. And we went from 6% voter turnout a few years ago to 9.6%. We're getting close, Sarah, to trying to get to double digits. But to give you all an example, the national average for major metropolitan areas is over 20%. So we're not even half as what we call here at the Morning News civically engaged, because there's no better marker than civic engagement than people turning out to vote for local officials. There's no better marker. And so we've got a lot of room to grow. And we take that as a challenge at the Morning News, because as Mayor Johnson and I kind of like to talk about sometimes, we're like, we got to make voting local cool again. We got to make caring about, your local community cool again. And so, we all have a responsibility to do that. One of the things I think that I wanted to touch on that also Sarah made note of, and it was really, Tony, it was the second largest consumed story that we had on dallasnews.com in 2020. And that was what I would call anything under the social justice movement. And as Sarah, uniquely said, this is not just what happened when George Floyd was killed and what happened all around the country after that. This also goes to the systemic point of what's still happening today. You look at the way that law enforcement handled what happened in Washington, D.C. versus the way they handled things last summer. It's very different. And that's very disturbing. You read us this morning, you would have read that until last week, the majority of all of the vaccinations that were being provided for coronavirus were in the northern part of our city, where the greatest need has been, because this pandemic has impacted people of color at a larger rate than it has, people not of color. And so why were we giving vaccinations to the areas of the city that arguably need it less than those who need it more? And so what I'm proud of within our content, and I'm not saying it's us that's changing things, but I'm telling you, it is the role of what is this fourth estate to hold government officials accountable, to make sure that what we're doing is right for society and kind of, right for our community. I think one of the biggest examples of kind of the social justice injustice in Dallas is what's happened with Shingle Mountain. For those of you who're not familiar with it, what Shingle Mountain is an area in Southeast Oak Cliff where 100,000-ton pile of roof shingles has been dumped into this community, and it was permitted for 260 tons max. So it's 384 times larger than what the city had said that this company could do with these roof shingles. Well, that's adjacent to a residential community. If this community would have been located in Highland Park, Richardson, I would argue that this would have never happened. But the problem is, not only did it happen, it's taken 3 years. I'm so glad that we're finally cleaning this up, but it's being cleaned up 3 years later. If Dallas was a market that really in a unified way stood up for this and this kind of injustice, we would not wait 3 years to clean up Shingle Mountain. And that is something that we have been covering for years, and I'm so happy it's finally being cleaned up. But it's probably 2 years and 11 and a half months longer than it should have been. So, there's just, look, but there's challenges, kind of throughout our community, throughout our country as it relates to this. And part of what we're trying to do at the Morning News too, Tony and Sarah, is we also know that we're not going to become an expert in Southern Dallas or more directly in the Black community overnight. So we chose to go partner with Texas Metro News. And we have formed a partnership with this Black-owned newspaper. And Cheryl, their publisher, and I are, and my whole team, we're trying to partner on things where Cheryl's team have been experts for, well over a decade in this community, so that we can be better with our sources. We can be better with the stories that we cover. We can help understand what does a more equitable community look like. And what I love is her team is teaching ours quite a bit, and our team is providing training to them to accelerate their business, and their digital transformation. And I just think it's an example where I've been a big believer that the Morning News can't just cover this, but then kind of talk the talk. I said, we need to start walking even a different walk as well. So before I shift over to fun topics, as I call them, Tony, do you want to go any more there? Or can I get into what we kind of jokingly refer to as the news that I'd called the vegetables to more of the sugar? But I'll pause there for a minute.
Despite the fact that we have social in our name at Social Venture Partners, and we like to be together and party and have fun, we're going to stick with a very serious topic here for a minute before we switch some of those topics. Sarah, I'd like to hear a little bit about your reaction to that in terms of the social justice, in terms of racial equity. Do you think that anything has actually changed? Grant brought up the murder of George Floyd. We had civil protests. We had all kinds of people jumping on the bandwagon of being really awakened, if you will, and understand how outrageous this is, the injustices that are in our system. But is it translating to any real policy change? Do you see that happening anywhere, Sarah?
I will say this, as a woman of color, and for anyone, many people now I think are starting to understand what that means exactly. I am encouraged, and I am choosing to be optimistic about where we are as a nation, as a local society, on this issue of social injustice and really the racial reckoning that came to pass this last year with the tragic killing of George Floyd. I think, we can look at business and a lot of changes that are happening within corporation. Many organizations are looking inward to say, maybe we weren't doing this right all along, or maybe the employees of color who've been saying things for years, decades, really, maybe they were onto something, and maybe the things they thought weren't fictitious and they weren't imaginative and it was not made up. So I'm choosing to stay optimistic. But with that said, I was, looking at some Pew Research Center numbers from September, a survey they did with adults around the country. And some of those numbers really, I think, were discouraging. And let me share. With that, what Pew shared in September was that, obviously, as we know, right after the tragic killing of George Floyd, there was and frankly, as we have not already stated, because of the pandemic and most people being at home, people saw it. I mean, Black men and people of color have been unjustly killed for generations. This is not anything new, starting from Emmett Till and many people who know that story. This is not new for our society. It's just that with the pandemic, people saw it. And with seeing it, I think there was this new awareness, but, and people, I had many friends, white friends calling, reaching out right after it, wanting to talk about issues that maybe I tried to broach with them several years ago, and they just weren't in the right space to engage. And so that was all encouraging. But then in looking at these Pew Research numbers from September, it shows that a majority, roughly 55% of adults, have some support for Black Lives Matters, which, as we know, is a movement that really sprang up or was highlighted following the killing of George Floyd this summer. But sadly, by September, what we were seeing is that numbers went down from what was about 67% right after the tragic killing to about 55%. And specifically, we saw that among whites and Republicans or people who lean right of center, that number was even lower than we saw with the resurgence even among Blacks, although that number was still slightly lower. And so when you look at that, and then you frankly look at the election results and what has transpired afterward, anyone who can do, really basic data analysis or just qualitative analysis are probably thinking, what does that mean? Like, where have we progressed and then we maybe went backwards a little? And I think that's where, I am choosing to remain optimistic, because I do know that the heart of many Americans is for us to civilly be together, work together, and that we are in a more diverse nation and state. And that means something as we look ahead to what that means for healthcare, what that means for education, and many other macro institutions that we have not solved. And so I think we just need to, these are uncomfortable conversations. Race has always been uncomfortable. But now hopefully people can see that it's not just a one-off, well, let me tell you about my experience as a Black woman, that it is systematic in the sense that there are systematic injustices that have been happening to people of color within systems. And hopefully now we can have that conversation, because that is where this information is engaged and that is where our society is impacted. And I'm hopeful for those conversations in the future.
Thank you. Grant, Sarah mentioned earlier that today's the opening day of the Texas legislature, and we had a session, our very last session was featuring the themes for the Texas legislature. What are you all seeing as the most important thing that comes out of the legislature? And do you think any of it will affect the systemic racism issues that our state faces around budgeting and where dollars go and to which communities? Can you comment a little bit about what you all are seeing in that regard?
Absolutely. As Sarah mentioned, the 87th legislature kicks off today. And we only do this every other year in Texas. So you got to take advantage of it while you've got this 4-month window to really see some progress. It's interesting. I think as we get started, what's fascinating actually, and for those of you who kind of saw the most recent news this morning, just a couple of weeks ago, we thought that the state's deficit was going to be $4.6 billion heading into this session. We reported this morning that it's actually closer to just under $1 billion. Now, again, no one wants to be starting with a deficit coming out of a pandemic, but I'll tell you that what we saw, and I guess what Comptroller Hagar was able to report yesterday, is at least starting things off today, we're in a better spot than we were than a $4.6 billion budget deficit. So what are those key things, Tony, to your point? Healthcare is going to be, well, let me start with education, because education is going to be, 1A and 1B this legislative session. House Bill 3, which was passed in 2019, was the largest healthcare bill ever passed in the state of Texas. That resulted in early childhood education, significant investments, teacher salaries saw a significant investment back then. And part of what I think is going to happen right now, Tony, is with any deficit, right? You'd rather go start a budget, a legislative session with a budget surplus. So there's going to be pressure on how many things that were passed in House Bill 3, which is a significant part of the state budget, but how many things are going to remain? I do worry a little bit. We worry a little bit and are watching. I'm worried that early childhood education could take a little bit, maybe get the most scrutiny because it's so young. Oh, well, maybe it takes so long to see those kind of things pay off. But, we call it the long game at the Morning News in terms of education. It's why we've launched an education lab this year and actually gotten some funding to double the size of our education staff. But, there's a lot there. I think when we go into healthcare, we've got healthcare because of the pandemic naturally is going to be an important issue, but also we still need to tackle the fact that Texas has more uninsured citizens than anywhere in this country. That is something where I'll give you a data point that I thought was interesting. In the past 3 years, 726,000 more children were uninsured than they were 3 years ago in the country. 726,000. 243,000 of those children were in Texas. So we make up 1/3 of the uninsured children, problem in the country just in the past 3 years. So I think the point there, Tony, to me, and one of the things that's got to be addressed, and look, the expansion of Medicaid issue has been political. We felt that start to get less political, I feel like, when we got closer, to this legislative session kicking off. But I don't know. I've had a lot of kind of private conversations with CEOs, and I think people still fear a little bit for the politics. But why does healthcare matter? We're 21, the cost of healthcare in Texas is 21% higher than the US average. We are attracting corporate headquarters to Texas almost, at a greater rate than any other state in the country. But if we don't address the healthcare problem, companies, although they're seeing favorable, corporate taxes by moving here, meaning state income for their employees and benefits for their companies, we got to be careful, and we're keeping a close eye on healthcare. One that I think is going to be interesting to see, does anything change with the bullet train between Houston and Dallas? This would be, the first bullet train in the country, which is really kind of fun to think Texas is at the front end of that. But that's been in discussion and in the works for, I think almost 7 years now. It's a $20 billion project. How much of that may actually need public funding is a little bit unknown. And as you can imagine, all the rural communities in between Dallas and Houston have a lot of reasons why they're concerned about that train, coming through there. And I'd say the biggest one and probably the most politicized is going to be redistricting. We just are completing our census for the country, trying to get that completed so that this can happen on time. But redistricting is something that always has some political undertones, or maybe not even undertones. It's fairly transparent in a lot of ways, of the ways that people are trying to redistrict so that they can protect the kind of seats that they have. And now that we're going to have new census figures, now is the natural time when that happens. So it's going to be a fascinating session. And I think it goes back to almost a little bit of what Sarah was touching on earlier, which is we all seem to really be aware of the presidential issues, but I really want to encourage North Texas to lean in and really track what's happening over the next 4 months, because what's happening in Austin is going to really directly impact people's lives.
Well, Grant, I appreciate that notion, and tracking is important, but what advice do you have for our audience on how to actually get engaged with the legislature and have their voices heard about these important issues that are affecting children and real people in the state of Texas?
Well, you want to start with those people who represent you in Austin most directly. The problem is now that things have started, they can always, obviously, write to, whomever is representing them, where they live. But I think there's also a piece here to really talk to and understand. And I would encourage people to go in and look at, and I love the work that Sarah and the Citizens Council do. I'm a proud member of the Citizens Council, and I think they're trying to very intelligently approach this session. I would encourage people to go look at things like Texas 2036, where Tom Luce and his staff have tried to say, here's what's good for Texas in a data-focused way, so that before people just make a judgment call on some of these things that may happen, they understand what they're trying to do. And I'll tell you, Dale Petrosky and his team, all of these civic organizations are trying to understand is what's going to happen in Austin of what impacts people. I would encourage them first and foremost to go read theirs, to read us, but then form an opinion of kind of reaching out, to those legislators, or write to us, and feel free to email me and my staff, our email addresses are published in the newspaper every day, so that we can put pressure on the legislators as they kind of work their way through the next 4 months, because that's really the role we're trying to play, is to make sure that they're passing some smart legislation.
Sarah, what's your response to that? How does our audience engage, and what are you all working on as priorities?
Yeah, so everything that Grant said, in the sense that, all the big issues he hit, from, I would say, school finance reform that was transformative and monumental last session, to healthcare, in the even transportation, mobility issues. I mean, they're all macro issues and issues that should be of the utmost concern. And as he said, you can engage through groups, but as citizens and residents of Texas, you can also, that has been debated and is being debated by our legislature, it is the people's capital. And so, safely, they're trying to figure out with COVID protocols how people can go to the Capitol and lobby or advocate for their issues. I mean, that's one way. But I do want to hit on something specifically that Grant said, and that's related to census and redistricting. The one thing I will say off the top, for many people who don't make it a part of their every biennium, kind of cycle, to watch the Texas legislature, is to know that the number one purpose of the Texas legislature every 2 years is to pass a budget. Full stop. That's why they're there. But within that, there are these issues and these other things that they've got to right size that have happened over the last 2 years, or that will happen in 2 years ahead. And so, as Grant said, I mean, the budget this year is not as bad as we thought. The controller has said, hey, there's going to be $112.5 billion for you to sort, but that's about $1 billion less than what they have had or expected. And with that, that includes education needs, park needs, other needs that are within that. And so I think as people start to look at the news coverage of the Texas legislature, you should, keep that in mind. But the one point I did want to hit on was specifically related to the census and redistricting and the direct line to civic engagement. And so, for many people who say, oh, that's political, I don't want to pay attention, you have to, because what is going to happen, redistricting is just not some cool thing that happens every 2 years based on census numbers. It is literally drawing the maps that will inform where your county hospitals will go, where who will represent you, and what pool of voters. And so again, it's that debate of whether representatives are choosing their voters or voters are choosing the representatives. That is what we're talking about. And so hopefully people, you spend some time getting a little bit engaged, because if people feel disenfranchised, if they feel that their district is not necessarily representative of their neighborhoods, they don't vote. And as Grant was saying earlier, what we then see are these single-digit voter turnouts for local elections. But then that also then equates to decisions being made at the local level that negatively adversely impact these individuals and their children and their families. We have a lot at stake for the next 10 years. And so hopefully people can engage in a new number of ways, through groups, through other, or just being citizens who advocate and reach out to the representatives.
Thank you, Sarah. Grant, I know that in your presentation, there are phenomenal topics that we would love to hear, and we just have a few minutes left, but I did want to go back to something that you said very early on in the top of the hour, when you talked about the importance of trust in relationships. And of course, the Dallas Morning News and the citizens of North Texas have to have an enormous amount of trust in your institution. And the fake news and all these issues have been raised so much that it's a big stressor, right? And so you want to have institutions of free press that you do trust. And you have an impressive background. You are a journalist and a MBA guy, and there is a business side to the news. And disheartening as it was, I sent this to you in advance. Reading about the parent company of my hometown paper, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and the Toledo paper, and talking about how that family that owns the paper tried to influence the reporters in the way they were reporting about the stories that were coming out. And so how do you do that? How do you keep the private interests of the business side of the Dallas Morning News from basically influencing what the reporters are actually doing and how they're seeing things out there in the streets?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'll tell you, I can proudly say that at least in my almost 3 years as publisher of this newspaper, I've never reached out to my editor nor anyone in my news staff and told them not to publish anything. Never. Because the minute you start doing that, frankly, you're crossing the line of what is intended to be an independent and free press. However, I think on the flip side, and let me explain a little bit, I think where people get confused too, Tony, in this world, which is, oh yeah, but Grant, you editorialize, and then why does a newspaper have an editorial page? Because, and I'll tell you, I'm very involved with the editorial voice, of the Dallas Morning News. It's a big part of my job, and it's something I truly value. I'll kind of quote one of the great Jim Lehrer, who I think is one of the greatest journalists, of not only this past generation, but maybe ever. And Jim Lehrer always had the way he always said it, especially within a newspaper, is to say, as long as your facts are true, I mean, as long as you are fair and balanced and are held to account in your news pages, then you earn the right to editorialize. And let me also kind of talk about, stick to the facts and things in your news pages. I would encourage everyone that no matter where you get your news and information is, you should go to someone though that when they do make a mistake, because we're human at the Morning News, we publish over 220 original pieces of content a day. When we get something wrong, we publish a correction in the newspaper and on the website the very next day. Because we're human. We're publishing 220 stories. We have 176 people in our newsroom. We're not perfect. But even though we're not perfect, we absolutely go publish those corrections. But I think, let me go back to the editorial page, because I think to your point too is, it is the role of a publisher to have a voice there. And let me give an example where I think part of what we're trying to be at the Morning News, Tony, is a voice of civility and intelligence and account and holding people responsible. But I'll give an example. The Houston Chronicle this past weekend, in their editorial, they asked Ted Cruz to resign, and it was rather aggressive. And you know what? That was their prerogative, and that is their ability to do that in an editorial page. But some of the conversations that we've had at the Morning News is also about, whether this be our Attorney General, whether it be Ted Cruz, whether it be other politicians in Texas who have gotten a rather large voice in this national scene. Part of what our conversations are internally is, we need to go show some examples and do some real journalism to say, what were the times when North Texas and Texans had a national voice? How did a Governor Bush become President Bush? And what were those things that attracted the country to Texas leadership, so that we can be more of an example of great leaders that make our community proud, rather than leaders who, as many would say, contributed to the, what happened last week. And I think that's just the thing where we're trying extremely hard to be a voice of reason, but a voice of accountability, in those editorial pages. But it comes down to, you've got to trust. And if you're not getting your facts right, if you're not owning up to the mistakes that you make, you've got a challenge. And one thing, because I also know this is very top of mind as well, Tony, is social media, and what role social media plays in all this as well. And I think there's a piece where what's difficult in running a media company today is that incorrect news travels really quickly over social media, like very, very quickly. And it's almost difficult to, when we are taking the time we have to go through a strong amount of filters before someone can publish a story. The fact checking, the source checking, and all those things that journalists are trained and employed to do gets blown up when things on Twitter that are not going through any filters just get out there into the ether. And I think what's hard, and that's the biggest challenge in my job, Tony, is, yeah, it's a business to run, but it's a business to run based on accuracy. And the reason why media companies do fact checking is because that's what we have to do for ourselves before we publish. And I'm very concerned about society right now and the impact of social media, where those people aren't following those same rules. And then, oh my gosh, people think that's the truth that's kind of flowing throughout our world. And it leads to some dangerous results and, leading, I'm concerned about our society if institutions that are trying to practice real, true Jim Lehrer type journalism, I can't financially make it.
I appreciate that. Folks, we're almost to the end of our hour. And Sarah, I just wanted you to have an opportunity to maybe share with our audience how the events of 2020 and now up until just this present moment are changing you and or if they have changed you in the way you think about things.
Yeah, I would say, as we've all seen, the events of 2020 are still evolving into 2021. But, as I was thinking about, really many of us could talk about relationships, the difference in society, even healthcare. There's a lot of differences. But, for me, I think the quote that best sums up where I am as far as, looking back at 2020 is a quote by the famous poet, Rainier Maria Rilke. And it says, "Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final." I think as we think about the siren call, the never ending loop that was 2020, one of the things that kept me going is the fact that this too shall pass. And this is, obviously a difficult period for our global society. But we are coming out of it with some innovations. And I think we will ultimately come out a better nation and a better community.
Thank you. Grant, how about you? How have you been changed?
It's interesting. I think, Tony, the pandemic taught me to slow down, not only personally, but professionally. I think obviously when you don't have to have an hour of commute time every day and you don't have to, you don't have all the busyness of, of just the way that our normal world works, it first taught me to slow down. But then it also taught me to find some, what I call space in my life. And I think some of that space is just being quiet, sitting still, processing things, rather than just kind of that quick speed by which many of us operate our life. And it's been fascinating. I would say where I was mentally having a hard time adjusting, to the pandemic and to that change in life, I almost feel better than I have mentally now, even after months, because I've allowed myself to slow down. And I'm trying to do the same thing for our team here at the Morning News, because I think if you slow down, you also make better decisions. You're also kind of a better, in this case, I hope I'm a better husband and father than I was. I'll leave it up to my wife and kids to, I guess, say whether that's true or not. But I've definitely learned a lot about getting some space.
I appreciate that. On behalf of our audience and the larger community, I want to thank both of you for the work that you are doing here in Dallas and North Texas for our citizens. Thank you for saying yes to my invitation to be on this call. There's great information in what you all have to say. To our audience, for those of you that are looking for an entry point, if you are trying to get more engaged than you already are, we welcome you to Social Venture Partners. We are a great place to get in and understand what's going on in the community and to exercise your own talents to help and to make a difference. We want to thank all of our sponsors who make these things possible. We are intentional and deliberate about keeping this digital gathering free so that the entire public can be on board. And so our sponsors, we thank you for that. And if you would like to join in helping us keep this available, please do. The Wright Knatzer Law Firm and Something Good Consulting has been consistent sponsors of ours all along. And so if you'd like to join them in helping us to achieve our financial goals, to do better in the community, to do good better, we certainly invite you to do so. Through all of this, it has been an extraordinary time and we have all had to sit back and reflect on many things. But I wrote a letter to the partners at Social Venture Partners yesterday, and in it, I included this. It said, last week, a man from Georgia named Reverend Raphael Warnock was elected to be the state's first Black senator. He said in his acceptance speech the other day, "Because this is America, the 82-year-old hands that used to pick somebody else's cotton went to the polls and picked her son to be a United States Senator. The improbable journey that led me to this place in this historic moment in America could only happen here." With the backdrop of all of the chaos, there is that has gone, I think, particularly unnoticed and unacclaimed. And so I join all of those citizens out there who have great hope for our future, but we must organize that hope, and we must be bold, and we must get to work, and we must speak the truth to the community. Once again, thank you to our audience for joining. Thank you to our panelists. It's great to be with you, and we look forward to seeing you in person at some point soon in 2021. Thank you all. Take care.